All right, let's talk a little bit about aggression and violence. So first of all, when we talk about aggression, what do we mean? We mean an intent and an attempt to harm another individual physically or socially, or in some cases to destroy an object. Now, this can be direct, which tends to be favored by men. Women might often be more indirect with their aggression. And we also are familiar with the concept of passive aggression. So that's where we're aggressive in our intent, but passive and indirect in the behavior. And you can see here that some of this behavior, falls along a continuum, right? So active, physical, direct aggression could be punching, or indirect could be a mean, practical joke. Active, direct verbal aggression could be insulting a victim. An indirect, active verbal aggression could be malicious gossip. Whereas passive, direct physical aggression might be obstructing someone's ability to get in or out of a room. Indirect might be refusing to complete a project. And then verbally, it could be refusing to speak, refusing to lend someone money. Now, aggression can be expressive. And here your textbook uses the term hostile, but generally we use the term expressive aggression versus instrumental aggression. Okay, and we see these are terms that we see used to describe homicides as well, which are obviously a type of aggression. So expressive aggression generally has to do with our feelings and our emotions. It's a response to something that's made us angry, something that's frustrating, a perceived threat. Okay, and the goal is to take it out on somebody or to make someone suffer. Whereas instrumental aggression tends to serve a purpose, right? So like somebody who kills somebody for money, that would be an instrumental homicide or instrumental aggression. Okay, there's competition, there's desire for some object or status. And so we see this play a role more in things like robberies, burglaries, larcenies, things that have some sort of aggressive element to it. Now, when we think about this from a victim's perspective, right, what do we think about aggression or violence? And violence is a type of aggression, and the word violence, I think, gets kind of overused in some ways where when what people really mean is aggression, right? They might say, oh, someone's words were violent, when what those words really were was aggressive. So aggression then is behavior perpetrated or attempted with the intention of harming one or more individuals, physically or psychologically, or to destroy an object. And then violence is actual destructive physical aggression intentionally directed at harming another person or things. Now, thinking about this from a psychological viewpoint, right? Theorists who are psychoanalysts are looking at things from a psychodynamic viewpoint, assume humans are prone to aggressive impulses, right? We are all prone to some type of aggression. And therefore, we're more likely to commit violent acts if we can't manage those impulses or those feelings, right? So if excessive pressure accumulates in the psyche, then an explosion is likely to occur. I think we talked about this in a prior chapter, that sometimes it's the cumulative effect of things that kind of pushes us over the edge, makes us quote unquote snap, or gets a reaction. And so it might be, the final thing might be kind of small, or something that alone would not evoke such a strong response. But because it's been building up, that's just one more piece. Now, looking at this ethologically, right? So thinking about what purpose might this serve, right? So in terms of territory, people would get aggressive, right? Because somebody violated their space. Okay. Now, at one point, this literally meant your land, which would be how you feed your family and take care of your family. Okay. And today it could mean someone who's just too close to you, right? For gangs, it could mean someone who has declared a certain turf or area to be theirs and you have encroached on it. What this does is it prevents overcrowding. Okay. If we go back into thinking about this from an anthropological point of view, right? And ensures the best and most powerful mates for the young. Now, today we engage in ritualized aggression, right? We transmit signals after which the more powerful dominant animal generally wins. So you see people sort of face off and all kinds of like, you know, territoriality that in reality today is not really about like your needs and survival, and probably more about saving face and like your ego getting bruised. Now, evolutionary psychology says our capacity to exercise control over our thought processes, motivation, and action, right, is a distinctly human characteristic. And aggression, to some degree, is viewed as normal, right? It's an adaptive behavior that's been naturally selected over the course of human evolution. Sorry, my slide was not changing. Okay. How does aggression rear its ugly head? Well, when we're frustrated, right? So if you've ever been a little road ragey or beeped at someone while you were driving, you know, or waved to them with your middle finger, that is often the result of frustration, right? So we're blocked from obtaining some expected goal, right? So like, you've cut me off, you've not let me go, you've gone too slow, and now I'm stuck at the light. Then I get frustrated, and that can generate anger. And then anger would predispose us or get us ready or prepare us to behave aggressively. Now, we don't always behave aggressively, right? But, you know, if you have honked, given someone the finger, then you've behaved aggressively. Now, when there are weapons in the environment, that ups the odds of aggression and ups the odds of aggression turning to actual physical violence, okay? When there are aggressive stimuli in our environment, it increases the likelihood of an aggressive response. And a weapon is really a good example, okay? Just the presence of a weapon, someone seeing your weapon. There's reasons that, like, you know, gang members and people that are involved in more of a street lifestyle, you know, do the little like lift up your shirt, let you know I have a gun, right? They're telling you to like back the heck off, right? Now there's some research that shows this, but there's been other studies that haven't been able to replicate that effect. But it also makes sense that if a weapon is present and someone is aggressive, right, or has become frustrated and now they're primed for aggression, and a weapon is readily present, that's going to increase the odds that the weapon gets used and increase the odds of someone being seriously hurt or killed. So when we experience some kind of aversive event, right, it produces some kind of negative affect for us, right? It might be like psychological pain, might be physical pain. We're going to be like uncomfortable, okay? Now, that unpleasant feeling might evoke aggression or violent responses, okay? And some people react to that very quickly, right? Some people are primed for a violent response. This can be the way you were raised. It can be a result of the community you grew up in, and maybe the community you grew up in for safety reasons required an aggressive response. And some people can really slow themselves down. Think about their feelings, try to control their feelings and actions, right? And that is a skill that hopefully we develop when we're young, but you can develop when you're older if you need to, you know, but it can be pretty easy for us to snap, for lack of a better word. Now, based on this assumption that there's some physiological arousal that dissipates over time, right? So when the person cuts you off, when someone has started something with you, right? When you get some distance from it, physical distance, distance by time, whatever, right? You find you're not as angry later on. This is why if you start like firing off a text to someone you're pissed at or an email because you're offended, it is often good to have someone proofread it or put it aside and don't send it right away. Now, with an email, this can be dangerous because if you've already put them in the to box, you might accidentally hit send. So maybe don't put a name in it yet, right? Come back to it later on. Maybe ask ChatGPT to tone it down for you a little bit, make it a little bit more polite or respectful, right? Because often we send it off and in the moment we're kind of like, yeah, F you, you jerk. I told you what's what. And then later on we don't care about it as much anymore and then we kind of feel stupid, okay? So that physiological arousal, right? Like getting kind of like ramped up about something, comes from one situation to another, right? And we're often unaware or not even thinking about the fact that like we're already in a mood. Something has already primed us when we end up in another situation. And it might be unrelated, but that might be the person who ends up having your frustration or anger taken out on them. Now that could be verbally, it could be physically, right? But we've all done this where you've like snapped at somebody and they weren't the actual like object of your frustration. You were already frustrated. Now, as I mentioned, sometimes this means the person against whom we direct or towards whom we direct that anger and frustration is not the actual source of our anger and frustration. Okay. Sometimes we sit around and we ruminate and we think about it over and over and over again, right? We're thinking about our feelings, right? We're kind of really in our feelings and sitting there and sometimes just like stoking the fire of our feelings, really keeping it going, right? We can harbor and maintain angry feelings over a period of time, right? This is why when people are like, oh, can you forgive and forget, right? Forgiveness is really not about other people. It's about you. You calming yourself down, you finding some peace, you letting it go so that it doesn't really carry over into the rest of your life. Now, all our learning theories are going to play a role here because how did we learn how to deal with frustration and aggression, right? So you guys probably know some people. Do you like how I'm assuming you're not these people? But generally, CJ friends, we are not as good at this. I don't know why, okay? But maybe because we just study such aggravating stuff that it like keeps us kind of aggravated, right? But some people can really roll with the punches. Like annoying stuff, they're just kind of like, oh, okay, oh well, right? And some people just can't. So we are going to learn a little bit, right? We learn so much actually from looking at other people and how do they behave and how do they respond. And we often model them back, right? Or imitate them. Sometimes we do this purposefully. Like we saw somebody, like I often recommend to students once they've gone to like a conference and done a presentation somewhere to also watch some other people and to think about whose presentation style did you really like? What did you like about it? How can you incorporate that into your own? If you saw a very ineffective presentation, what didn't you like about that? How do you pull that out of your presentations, right? And so sometimes it's happening subconsciously and sometimes it's happening consciously. Maybe you've got a job, maybe you've got a role model at your job. You really like them. You really look up to them. You might start to emulate them, do things the way they do things. Okay? So we often learn by watching others. Now, some things are going to prime us to learn aggression, right? So, do you see a lot of aggression? If you've seen a lot of aggression, right, you've got more examples of it. Have you been reinforced? Has that behavior in you, when you've been aggressive, have you been rewarded for it in some sort of way, right? Are people like, yeah, you're such a badass. You don't take anybody's shit. Are you often the object of aggression? And who do we copy with this? Well, first of all, there's our family. There's the people we spend a lot of time with, in a house with, growing up with. There's all the subcultures we belong to. That could be sports. It could be dance. It could be art. It could be a gang. It could be whatever subcultures you've grown up with. And then there's also symbolic models for us in mass media. And I think it'd be interesting to really think about like how we see stuff play out on social media too. Because social media has specifically been designed to provide you with dopamine hits. Now, we all differ in our ability to learn from observation. Sometimes we don't notice behavior. Like we don't even see it happening, right? Sometimes we see it happening and we're like, oof, I really don't like that. Every now and then I've seen somebody do something that I think maybe I do. And I think to myself, ooh, stop doing that. Whether it's hearing someone like say a lot when they're doing a presentation and all of a sudden you're like, oh crap, I think I do that a lot. Maybe it's hearing somebody's badass response to someone else and you're like, oof, I think that's what I sound like. So what are some key components then of us learning through observation? Okay. Are we motivated to rehearse that behavior? Do we see what happens to the model? You guys remember in a prior chapter, I told you about how I had a kid on probation whose uncle or cousin, I don't remember who, right, an older male in his life had made a lot of money from drugs, and while he was telling him not to sell drugs and not to do drugs and make better choices, this kid was like, yeah, but he always had cash and he always had nice clothes, right? And so, like, what are you seeing? If you're seeing someone get rewarded for bad behavior, then you might want to follow the bad behavior. We don't have to be reinforced every single time we do something, okay? Periodic reinforcement is enough. Okay, so what are some models of aggression? So cognitive scripts models basically says that aggressive behavior is learned and memorized through our daily experiences. We have direct experience with things, and we observe the people in our lives. So there's probably many things you do that are similar to the way your mom or your dad or your grandma or whoever you spent a lot of time with growing up, the way they do it. You guys will find when you get out of college, late 20s, early 30s, as you really get into like serious adulthood, you'll hear yourself say something that you hated when your mom or dad or whoever said it to you, and you'll be like, damn, oof, okay, just heard my mom. This is hard to change. Now, the hostile attribution model says that youth and adults prone towards violence are more likely to interpret ambiguous actions as hostile or threatening. You guys have all seen this happen, okay? You've seen someone who just assumes the worst, right? I've seen this happen out. I mean, it's been a long time since I spent any time in like a bar or a club, but when I was, around your age, a little older, I would see this happen. Somebody has bumped into somebody, and some people are just predisposed to see that as purposeful, and then to like get all what in someone's face, right? And for that to escalate. And some people are very quick to like, they might not even be the person who bumped into someone, but to be like, oh my God, I'm so sorry, I didn't see you there, right? Even if they're the person that was bumped into, right? Some people, even if they got an apology from someone, are just primed to be like, take that the wrong way, right? Misinterpret things. Now, kids who are like this are twice as likely to see aggressive behavior where there is none, okay? Now, thinking about this verbally, right, we can see this like with texting, right? Someone texts you something. If it doesn't have like an emoji or like it doesn't say ha 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 after it, right? It can be easy, depending on your mood and how you think someone is reacting to you, to misinterpret that, okay? We've all misinterpreted something. We've probably all said something that was misinterpreted too. Now, this perspective starts during preschool, and peer rejection is going to play a role in that, right? So are things like, do you have a history of just being treated poorly? Then yeah, you're going to see bad motives in other people's behavior, okay? Because that's what you've experienced. People who grow up in abusive homes become hypervigilant. They can tell the difference in how someone's footsteps land as to what kind of mood someone is in, okay? They are looking for cues and always ready to defend themselves, okay? Now, this exists on a continuum. Boys with lower status amongst their peers are going to have a stronger reaction like this. This reaction is more common in psychopaths, and it's more common amongst persistent offenders. Persistent offenders, remember I told you guys that like most people, when they're young, start to engage in some delinquency and they age out of it. Like you guys would already be on the aging outside of like, stupid behavior, okay? Persistent offenders, right? And some of that is rooted in just being a teenager, right? It's rooted in like biological changes that are happening to us, societal changes, and that's why we grow out of it, okay? Some, though, become chronic, persistent, lifetime offenders. They start earlier and they don't age out, okay? And it makes sense that people who are easily frustrated, who see negative motives in other people's behavior, are gonna like get in arguments, get in fights, punch walls. So aggression can be like a simple, direct way of resolving conflicts, right? Like you give me a hard time, I just pop you one in the face, right? Wow, that should say fewer cognitive skills, okay? And purely simple. Wow. I really need when I make typos for them to be obvious typos and not actual words so that spell check will catch it. But the fewer cognitive skills you have, right? You're not going to be able to talk your way out of situations as easily. Okay? So our ability to control the outward expression of anger is what's going to predict our violence, right? We can be easily aroused, easily frustrated. How good are we at controlling that when that happens to us, right? And if you're not as good at that, then you're more likely to find yourself getting in trouble and responding with aggression and violence. So the general aggression model draws very heavily on these cognitive social learning theories. Okay, now these social learning theories, unless you took this course and you are not a psych, human service, or CJ major, which if that's the case, welcome. We love to have you, right? But if you're one of those majors, you have learned these theories several times. Okay, so aggression and violence depend on how do we perceive and interpret our social environment. Sometimes someone has said something to you that was passive aggressive and that they meant in a shitty way, and you didn't even pick up on it. You just went about your day. And then what are our expectations about different outcomes, right? Like if I think I can pop you in the mouth and it'll shut you up and I won't get in trouble for it, then I might respond that way. Repeated experience is going to ingrain those scripts in us, like how we tend to respond, right? So is our culture, which is to say, I mean, certainly some of this is ethnic culture, right? But it can also be like street culture. Like if you're growing up in a heavy gang area, right? The cultural response is going to be violence. And it's not just going to be that violence is okay. It's going to be that violence is expected. And if you don't respond violently, you're the one who now stepped out of line. Now, violence often occurs because we have this escalation going on. So we may have a triggering event. Maybe it's pretty serious, but it might be minor, right? And then we're thinking like, is this worthy of retaliation? Do I feel I'm justified in retaliating? So that aggression and violence depend on our knowledge and beliefs about how the people we retaliate against will respond to us. And the degree to which we believe we have the ability to respond effectively. Right? So you guys have probably all seen some tiny, scrawny people mouth off against some really big people who look pretty powerful and thought, no, it does not seem like a good decision. Most of us would be like, oh, this is not a time to mouth off. Now, I3 theory is the process by which a factor promotes aggression. So how do risk factors work together to create or reduce aggression? Okay. So there's instigating triggers. These are incidents that arouse our tendencies or predisposition and make us conducive to aggression. So that's sort of like the thing that instigates it. Okay. Maybe you just really push my buttons and call me something terrible today. Right. Now, impelling forces are going to be things that increase the likelihood of an aggressive action. And inhibiting forces are going to be things that decrease the likelihood of an aggressive action. Okay? Aggression can be overt, it can be covert, and they're going to differ in terms of like behavioral patterns, emotions, etc. So overt aggression is generally direct, right? And generally decreases with age, right? We learn a little more tact as we get older. Emotions involved are generally anger, high levels of arousal, often lacking social cognitions, right? So basically like we can't come up with a non-aggressive solution. And this tends to begin early, especially with boys. Whereas covert aggression is concealed and dishonest and sneaky behavior. Increases with age. Less emotional. We see this with things like fraud or larceny or theft. You do have to be planful. And it can evolve as a well-planned strategy. So reactive aggression appears to be a reaction to frustration, and it's generally associated with us having less control over our emotions because our emotions, like, we're really aroused, okay? This is like temper tantrums in little kids, vengeful hostility, expressions of anger. Whereas proactive aggression is less emotional, and it's driven by expectations of rewards, It's unprovoked. It's deliberate. It's a tool. Bullying, dominating someone, engaging in coercive acts. It's a little more instrumental, right? It's aimed at achieving a goal. Now, what are some differences along gender lines? Now, by the way, we see these differences start to emerge at a pretty young age. A big part of this is how we socialize, boys versus girls, okay? And this is not to say, even though men commit the overwhelming majority of violence in our society, it's not to say that there aren't women who could absolutely whoop your ass. I have absolutely seen some girls just wreak some havoc. I had 2 girls get in a fight in a program while there were only 2 staff on duty. One girl was mad at the other staff, so that was not helpful. And one girl grew up in Southie and one girl grew up in Charlestown. So if you grew up around here, you understand, you probably were just like, uh-oh, that's not going to end well, right? These are both neighborhoods where people have been taught to respond with violence. And it eventually escalated, and the girls went at each other, and I did a little revert to Catholicism in order to break them up. Now, generally when 2 people are mad at each other, it's not as dangerous for you to break that up. It's still dangerous. You could catch a stray fist, right? But it's not as dangerous because they're not mad at me. And I was able to pull one girl out and tell her to just leave, and I dealt with the other girl, okay? But that could have gone in a wildly different direction. And if they'd been mad at both of us, the reason my friend Suzanne did not handle that, she took all the other kids, is because it escalated. The girl was triggered by something Suzanne said to her, okay? Which is basically telling her to, like, you know, stop misbehaving, okay? So girls, I think I told you guys this before. Girls tend to engage in relational aggression, right? It's covert. It's sneakier. I told you that I have worked with a lot of teenage girls who I have watched them like pretend to be your best friend for a period of months and then destroy your life, okay? They do things like abandon one friend in favor of another. They do passive aggressive things like post pictures on Instagram so that you know you weren't included, right? So like I have teenage nieces, so I see this happen all the time. That one kind of gives them plausible deniability, right? But like, if you know the people involved, you know the tone, right? We obviously didn't have social media when I was a kid, but I can remember a time in 7th grade where I don't know why my best friend was mad at me, but she wrote a note, passed it to someone else in front of me, and on the outside of the note, it said, "To Michelle, my best friend." And like the whole point was for me to see it and see that she called someone else her best friend, right? Boys engage in much more physical aggression. So I've worked with teenage boys as well. They would get in fights, hit each other, and then be fine by lunchtime. Media violence, what kind of impact does this have? Research is kind of all over the place on this. So you're not going to like just become a violent jerk by watching media or playing violent video games, right? I would bet there's a lot of people, in our class who enjoy violent video games or violent movies. I mean, look at the, CJ friends, look at the stuff we've chosen to study, right? Not necessarily reflective of us wanting to do those things to other people. However, if you already want to hurt other people and then you're seeing that rewarded, right, in the media, or you're like playing a lot of video games where you can kind of take that out, then that might fuel that. Now, there's also some research that looks at copycat and contagion effects. We've seen this. There's some research. It needs to be updated, so I'm not sure if it holds true as we've had more and more mass shootings. But for a while, there was a period where if you'd have one mass shooting, you'd basically have another, or school shooting, you basically have another one within 10 to 14 days. So sometimes people copy something they've seen in the media. We've seen this with just silly, dumb stuff on TikTok, right? Like there was that period where kids were eating Tide Pods, like they're eating detergent, or they're just trying dumb things they've seen on the internet. It depends on how the media is portraying these things, right? Do you portray it like it's fun and a good time? It basically has the same effect as other social learning. Or it can have the same effect.